Alright, let's get into the monthly wrap up of the books that I was reading this month, starting with a book that has been on my reading list for a very long time, possibly 2 or 3, maybe even 3 years, and that is The House of Leaves. Like I say, I've been wanting to read this book pretty much ever since I heard about it. A friend of mine gifted it to me, like I say, several years ago, and because I knew it was, I know it's an intense book, it's a bit of a puzzle book, it's quite complicated, at least in the way that it's structured. I've just not had it on my radar, and it's just been there waiting and waiting. But I finally decided, because I've been in a bit of a reading slump, to get out of that by reading this book, and I'm pretty impressed. I've not read very much, maybe about 30 pages or so I don't have much to say yet, but what I will say is that this book is very interesting and pretty much grabbed my attention from the start. For those of you who don't know, this mysterious book is told metafictionally, and it's the sort of edited volume of a collection of notes by a guy called Johnny Truant, who is basically putting together this manuscript that was written by somebody else on this autobiographical film, or this documentary film. And it's kind of a novel within a novel within a novel, and while you have the manuscript of the person talking about this documentary film, you also have Johnny Truant's notes on this documentary film, and sometimes he even makes changes to the manuscript as well. So it can get very confusing, and it probably already is confusing just by my description. But the documentary itself, so far anyway, is about a family who have moved into this house, and they are trying to sort of get their family reconnected. The husband is a photographer who spends a lot of time away. His wife was going to leave him. This is his way of getting things back together and reconnecting with his family. But all is not what it seems with this house, and obviously it's going to end probably tragically, I don't know, because it's all very mysterious still at this point. But yeah, this book is amazing. I wasn't expecting to like it so quickly, or at least being intrigued by it. It really is too early to tell whether I will enjoy it. There's always a risk with a novel like this that has a sort of gimmick, you might want to say, that the gimmick doesn't work, or that it relies too much on it and it just wears thin as it progresses. So that is in the back of my mind, but at the very least so far I'm finding this book deeply atmospheric, deeply interesting, and I'm hoping that it's going to be the first novel to scare me, because books aren't really scary things. I've never read a novel that did scare me, well, except for when I was a kid. The second Harry Potter book and the snake actually did creep me out a bit, but since I've become an adult, books haven't scared me. Let me know in the comments any books that scared you, and why you think that happened, and do you get scared by books generally when compared to other media like films? The only other thing to say about this book is that the narrator himself is pretty unlikable, and the framing story with him it doesn't paint him out to be the greatest guy in the world, but nevertheless, how much of this we can trust, who knows, we'll just see where it goes. And it's not really a criticism of the novel, it's just something that I have observed, and that's all I can really say at this point. Hopefully I'll continue to enjoy it, or not, but either way you'll get my thoughts on this book once I have got it finished. Next up we have Babel by R.F. Kuang, which is a book that I reviewed very recently on the channel, but it is a book that I read this month, so I will talk very briefly about it. For those of you who didn't watch that review, this is the story of a guy called Robin Swift, who is originally from China. He gets adopted by a man called Robert Lovell, who comes to China, and Robert is a sort of hostile guardian. He's not a great guardian, but he does raise Robin, he teaches him, and eventually Robin goes off to Oxford to study language in the linguistics department at the University of Oxford. But there is a twist to this world. It's set in the Victorian period, but there is magic in this world. There are these silver bars which do magical things that relate to language, and the department at Oxford basically controls these bars. And Robin goes to the department. He runs in with some thieves who are stealing these bars and sort of redistributing them. The implication being that England is sort of hoarding them for themselves and not sharing them with other countries. And Robert kind of joins in this revolution. I won't say very much other than to say that I found it a very engaging novel, at least in terms of the prose style, but I found that the politics was too much in your face. Clearly the story has a message, and if you weren't sure what the message was just by reading the story, there are even little footnotes for the author to tell you what the message is, which is always wonderful. That's just what I want from fiction, is to have the author shoving their how they want me to interpret their novel down my throat. And also I found some of the characters also weren't that great. The characters were really just mouthpieces for very polemicized ideas about racism, about the colonialism and all of that stuff. Nothing wrong with writing novels about political issues, nothing wrong with writing an issue, book about race, whatever. I just felt like it was done in a way that didn't quite work for me anyway with this novel. Another thing that really bugs me was the magic system, which I just thought didn't work. One of the problems with creating a fantasy world that's already within a historical world or even the present day world is that you always have to then come up with explanations for why the world is more or less as it is, except with the addition of this magic. Or you need to drastically change the world, because of course, if the world had magic in, it would not be the same world that it was. Unfortunately, Kuang doesn't really engage with that. We still have things like the strikes at the factories with the Industrial Revolution. But if there's magic silver doing the stuff, that seems to change things, because why do you need to rely on like children working in factories and all the labour things? It's just not obvious that the kinds of strikes and the kind of issues that happened historically would happen if you just replaced everything with this very simplistic silver bar mechanism. So I didn't find that didn't really work for me. I think if you're going to do this sort of integration thing, you have to think about it a little bit more than the author maybe did. So that didn't work. And so overall, it wasn't really a novel that I enjoyed very much. And surprise, surprise, it was a novel that was recommended to me rather than one that I picked. So I was going into it with a little bit of trepidation, just because, like I've always said before, I'm quite good at picking novels and knowing intuitively whether I like them. I was pretty open to this one because I didn't know much about it. But by the end, I just wasn't really having it. But there we are. Next up, we have a novel that I enjoyed significantly more, and that is Where Angels Fear to Tread by E.M. Forster. This is his first novel, but actually it's the last novel of his that I read. I've read all of his other novels, and this was my last one to get through, and I really enjoyed it, and I wasn't quite expecting to. It tells the story of a woman called Lila, and she is recently widowed to a man it seems like she didn't love all that much. He belongs to an incredibly snobby family, the head of which is this very snobbish matriarch, Mrs. Harrington, who doesn't like Lila at all and kind of just wants to get rid of her to Italy so that she can get influence on her younger daughter, because she thinks Lila is a bad influence on her child. So Lila goes to Italy and she falls in love with a man 10 years her junior in Italy called Gino, and they have a child and they get married, much to the shock of the Harrington family. Philip Harrington is the son of this family, and he comes basically to Italy to tell Lila that this can't go ahead. And the novel really isn't about Lila as much as actually about Philip as someone who is quite snobbish, someone who's a little bit hypocritical. He wants to be this big idealistic person, but he isn't. He's sort of ironic and detached from life, and typical with Forster, the message is that Philip needs to connect with life. It's also quite a tragic story, lots of unexpected twists and turns, and where the novel ends is not where I thought it would at all. Of all Forster's novels, this is the one that really goes from one thing to another, and I think it works really well. And maybe there's an argument that some of the changes don't quite fit together, but I think actually the changes are quite good, and it kept me on the edge of my seat as much as a social novel can. There was lots to enjoy with this one. The character portraits were hilarious, especially Mrs. Harrington and her daughter, Harriet. They are both just incredibly shrewish, snobbish women. You have Mrs. Harrington, who is this master matriarchal manipulator. And in a lot of modern fiction, that kind of woman, she tends to get a sort of positive representation. You know, she's very witty and she's funny, and even though, she's probably wrong on some things, she's also somewhat wise. Whereas this is the complete flip side to that. This is maybe more true to the reality of that kind of snobbish, controlling matriarch who is incredibly obsessed with keeping up appearances and ensuring that the family toe the family line to keep the reputations together. She's incredibly cold, incredibly calculating, but she is also still very witty and funny, and I like that Forster was able to do that, to make her funny and clever, but also to show that more manipulative side. As for the daughter Harriet, she is just an unlikable person through and through. She wants to be like her mother, but she never will, because she's not intelligent in the way that her mother is. She's overbearing, she's over the top, and she's just not a very nice person, but it works really well for the novel. Also, for a Forster novel, there is death, but there aren't any ridiculous deaths like people dying in football accidents or bookcases falling on them, so I will give him props for that too. It's a very breezy novel to read. I read it within 2 days, and I could have just read it in one, really. It's just that I was busy on the first day, so didn't. But yeah, it was just such a nice, gentle read, and I have heard some reviews say that it's very similar to what's it called, A Room with a View by Forster, and I didn't find that. It does have a similar sort of framing narrative in that people are travelling abroad and they find love there and then things ensue, but the actual sort of overall story is actually quite different. You can see that Forster is definitely setting up what is basically his major theme here throughout most of his work, which is this sort of social novel, but also this romantic relationship between a man and a woman, but it's still its own thing, and I think it's definitely worth not sleeping on if you've read his more famous novels. And lastly, I thought that Philip was an excellent protagonist. Forster does this pretty much in all of his novels. He has protagonists that feel very much like they have a flaw that's quite fundamental. In Philip's case, like I said, he's sort of sarcastic, detached, and he thinks he's above everything and can live in this high world of aesthetics and high ideals. And then basically the story is him coming into contact with reality and realizing that that's not the case. And he gets punched in the face several times in this story, metaphorically and also I think physically too. And his realization is very believable. But what Forster does that I think works effectively is that he doesn't leave his character fully rewarded for what he's learned or even fully ready to go. He has this particular issue, and by the end of the novel he's significantly improved, but he's still got a long way to go. And I think that Forster as a writer does that kind of character really well. A flawed hero who still has a lot of work to do to work things out, but in the course of this novel they've at least worked one thing out, which I think is excellent. And also because there's still work for them to do, it leaves you as the reader thinking about what might happen in the future, not just for him but for the other characters as well. The last thing that I read, or maybe more accurately watched this month, was As You Like It by Shakespeare. This is one of his popular comedies. It's not his most popular one, but it's typically highly regarded. It's a love story centering on the romance between Rosalind, a young woman, and Orlando. And basically there's some political stuff at the beginning of the story that leads Rosalind to be exiled from her uncle's home, and she takes her cousin with her, and they leave, and they go out into the world and live in the forest of Arden. Rosalind disguised as a boy, because of course it's a Shakespeare comedy, so someone has to be disguised as someone of the opposite sex. Now I have watched this version twice and read it once, and I think that it's just a play that maybe just can't be performed, or at least I've just been very unlucky with the performances that I've seen. The one that I watched this time was the BBC's one with Helen Mirren as Rosalind, and it just didn't work all that well for me. And the one that I saw previously, it was one of the RSC ones that they've recorded, and that also didn't work for me. I don't know what it is. When I read it, I enjoyed it a little bit more, but still, this one just isn't grabbing me at all. I just find that it doesn't really do much. The side plots don't really integrate well with the main plot. I do think Rosalind is an excellent character, but one thing that I find in the people that like this play, and I'm thinking here of Harold Bloom, whose book I'm reading as I'm going through the plays, is that often they just focus on Rosalind. In fact, Bloom even doesn't really rate Orlando much as a character, and he doesn't even rate the relationship between Celia and Rosalind all that much either. Some modern critics do because they sort of interpret a sort of lesbian relationship there. I don't see it, but there you are. People love to do that with Shakespeare these days. In any case, I just found that the centerpiece of the play really is Rosalind, which even people who like the play admit, and it just isn't enough. You know, a play can have a fantastic, stellar character in it, but sometimes it needs to have other things that really make it work, and for me, As You Like It just didn't have that. It has some nice moments, it has some great speeches, it has a great character in Rosalind, but there's just something about the play that doesn't grab me in the way that Shakespeare's other plays do and his other comedies do. If you like As You Like It, let me know down in the comments why you do like it, because yeah, it just isn't hitting for me at all, so it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts if you do like it, and maybe when I do another read I can try and think of those things while I'm reading the play and see if my attitudes towards it change. That's not to say I hated it, it just basically left me quite flat. Alright, that is it for everything that I have read this month. Let me know down in the comments what books you've been reading this month, what books are you looking forward to reading next month if you have any, and also your thoughts on any of the books that I've read. Otherwise, take care everyone, ta-ra!